Hello, I'm Dave Stodder with TDWI. I'm Director of Research for Business Intelligence. And with me is Steve Dine. He's Managing Partner of Datasource Consulting and a member of the TDWI faculty. So Steve, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Dave.
Yeah. Well, let's see, there's all kinds of things we could talk about. Data architectures right now, it's really a time of change, and certainly in the data warehousing community, with big data and lots of different options. I know you've been talking about a lot of that kind of thing in your courses, and a couple of things we could talk about, I thought, with cloud, cloud, BI, and data warehousing. That's sort of a new option, particularly for organizations that want to get something up quickly. So what are you talking about with folks around cloud, and what are some of the sort of advisories that you would give for BI and data warehousing?
Well, cloud's an interesting area because while the technologies themselves are similar to what we do on site, some of the processes that we work in the cloud are a little bit different. The ways that we architect, for instance, ETL is a little bit different because we're moving data over a wire, and a lot of times with, in fact, just about every time with network speeds that are lower than we have internally. So moving large amounts of data and considering how we actually strategize for that is a little bit different than what we might do internally. We also think about how to architect within the cloud, and depending on which provider you choose, a lot of cases we have to think about things like how do we back the data up, how do we recover in case of disaster, how do we architect for the fabrics that they're creating in the cloud. A lot of times they're not designed specifically for BI. For instance, they might have slower network speeds between the nodes. In a lot of cases, they're maybe not even located on the same racks within the data center or even the same subnets. So how we architect in the cloud can be a little bit different from what we might do on site. But the technologies themselves in a lot of cases are very similar.
Right. And so, I've seen actually, in fact, well, where are we? In San Diego, but in Vegas, I've seen some huge cloud facilities that some of the eBays of the world, for example, are using. Are you seeing that kind of, well, maybe those are sort of rare, but are you seeing scaled, pretty high scale cloud implementations right now, or where are we kind of in the maturity cycle, would you say?
Interestingly enough, the maturity cycle is hard to measure. I would say we're still sort of at the cusp of the early stages of maturity in cloud from the perspective of user adoption, but the technologies are becoming a lot more mature. So it's sometimes a little bit more difficult to measure. I think when we originally created a course on BI in the cloud probably 3.5 years ago and started teaching it, thought that cloud adoption would be a lot faster than it has been. And so we're still at an area today where cloud adoption is still fairly slow. We did a survey last year and found that, as we had suspected, that larger organizations were slower to get in the cloud than smaller organizations. And there are reasons for that that are obvious, but also we're seeing a lot more the larger organizations creating private clouds within their own centers. And so when we start talking cloud, it's one of those generalized terms where we have to be very specific about whether we're talking about public clouds, private clouds, or we're talking about what type of services, whether it's infrastructure as a service or platform as a service or software as a service. And it's become such a generalized term that sometimes we have to be very specific when we talk cloud to really understand what we're trying to do within the cloud and what services are being provided.
Yeah, I suppose so. And of course, what they're doing, whether it's like analytic sandboxes, would you consider that a cloud? If somebody's sort of spinning up a sandbox, I guess that's sort of mixing metaphors, but.
I think in the end of the day, it really doesn't matter what we call things in some. We call things certain things to classify them, categorize them, but it also helps to understand sometimes from a contextual perspective what it is we are talking about. And so we tend to sometimes overgeneralize to try and fit within a category, and sometimes we try and be very specific to segregate things out of the category. And so from a sandbox perspective, I guess you could. The way I try and classify cloud is based off of characteristics to try and understand, is it cloud, is it not cloud? But at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is enable agility, we're trying to enable flexibility, and we're trying to enable scalability. And in some ways, increased economies of scale. So things that meet those criteria, I think we start breaking down what do we truly think from a cloud perspective versus a sandbox itself in itself may not meet all the characteristics of cloud. but it might meet a few of the characteristics. And so then it's our determination of whether we truly want to call it cloud or we want to call it something else.
I'll throw another term at you. This one is kind of sounds like a mystery novel, but shadow IT. Now, is cloud something that appears often as a shadow IT system? And yeah.
It can, absolutely, and that's once again when we start talking about the nuances of cloud. So where we tend to see it pop up more is around software as a service or platform as a service, mainly because they're easier to deal with from a functional perspective. Shadow IT, we find, generally lives in the functional areas, the business areas, versus the IT areas. Not in all cases, but in the majority. And the software as a service and the platform as a service, usability is a little bit easier, or there's sort of fewer, I want to call it, moving parts, less to understand. The vendors do provide a lot of the capabilities to connect into that are more common to what a business user might be used to. For instance, just an HTML interface to get at a report or their data. Whereas we find maybe shadow IT is less involved, or at least right now, in the uptake in infrastructure as a service. Some of that has to do with some security requirements and around the organization. The other is just that the platforms might be a little bit less mature and a little bit more difficult or challenging to work with from an infrastructure perspective.
Okay. Well, I always think of cloud as being sort of part of this whole thought around virtualization and platforms and IT, whether they be networks or storage or servers, or gradually being virtualized. What kind of issues does that present from a data warehouse perspective, I guess you could say? I mean, is that something that is a concern, that changes their view of what they're doing, or not?
It can, and I think there's a few things to think about when we start virtualizing. And we're essentially leveraging the hardware and trying to put more on the hardware to leverage the capabilities and the capacity of that hardware itself, and really scale things out. Now, the challenge is that the more we put on hardware, the more contention we get.
Yeah.
So there are things you really need to think about. Now, I say the old days, but even as 2 or 3, 4 years ago, that virtualization added a lot of overhead on top of each instance on the virtual machine. Nowadays, it's much, much less and much more efficient, faster, and also the more advanced virtualization platforms do a great job at balancing out workload and auto-migrating instances.
Even for BI and data warehousing workloads?
They can, for sure. But now the challenge is when we start talking about BI workloads, data warehousing workloads, we really have to start thinking about, in the more intense situations, balancing out processor, memory, and I/O. And that can be a challenge in a virtualized environment, but it can be a challenge in any environment, to be honest with you. But we do have to pay a little bit more attention to what else is running on those servers. And so as we start mixing workloads on the same hardware, we can run into challenges. If we run all analytics, if we run multiple instances of different analytic applications on the same piece of hardware, that can also present some challenges. So we have to monitor. We have to really be careful about how we architect and ensure that we have the right performance.
So would that be a top question, you think, in terms of if someone's looking at cloud, as a possible implementation option, asking, what else is running on your equipment out there in the cloud? Is it?
Oh boy, in the public cloud scenario, you may ask, but you may not get an answer. In fact, you probably most likely not get an answer. It's really up to you to measure your performance and determine, in the case of utilizing, for instance, like an Amazon Web Services, which we call AWS, in that case, you have different options. And so you can determine, for instance, you can take all your characteristics, for instance, how much data volume do we have, what's our concurrent usage, what type of workloads are we running, analytic or operational, how much data has to move between nodes. Like, we can look at all those different characteristics and think about ahead of time, how do we architect? Because we know that, for instance, in their EC2, generalized EC2 area for just a regular instance that I might spin up, we know that that's going to go on a generic node that, I'm not going to know what's going to run on it, but I know the interconnects might be fairly slow. And I know that depending on the hardware that we choose to put our data, whether it's on the ephemeral instance or an EBS or even an S3, I know the performance characteristics. So I can start determining what might perform and what might not. I also might look at the database, for instance, that's housing the data. Whether I choose what type of architecture, whether it's sort of an SMP architecture or an MPP architecture, because once I start distributing my workload across nodes, I can really only move as fast as my slowest node.
Right.
So we have to really think about node skew and balance, and there are different options that are provided to be able to work within that. There's also some databases options. For instance, they have an option for called Redshift, which is an analytic database option, which provides an MPP columnar architecture on local storage with high-speed interconnects and a lot of memory. And then they can balance that CPU a little bit easier. But other options out there, for instance, SaaS, those options you can actually, the vendors manage that. And there are some vendors out there, Cognitio, MicroStrategy, that have a platform, we call them platform as a service, that provides that whole platform for you. And they're really managing the workload characteristics and the different types of options to best meet your environment.
So would those platform as a service options be quite different from what, say, Amazon is offering with Redshift then? And is that sort of a different approach?
A little bit. What Amazon provides is on-demand computing. And what the other vendors really are providing is managed computing and managed platforms. So whereas in a vendor-managed platform where they're managing the hardware, doing all the software upgrades for you, maybe even updating the operating systems, keeping everything behind the scenes that are managing it for you. In an Amazon environment, really all they're managing for you is the hardware.
And so Redshift, what they're contributing there then is an analytic database that's running on the hardware. So what would the terminology be to describe that then, I guess?
Interestingly enough, I would probably say it's a database as a service, but I know others have coined that term, so I'm not sure if they could call it that, but it's basically a database as a service. And there's a number of them out there, like Windows Azure is a database as a service, and they, I guess, would probably call it platform as a service. But there's also other types. I mean, you can, for instance, have an Oracle database or maybe a SQL Server database as a service. There's a lot of vendors out there providing it. The question is, do I want to pay for it on demand or even reserve that time? Or do I want to pay for it on a monthly or yearly subscription, which some of the other vendors are providing? So I can sort of purchase that on a subscription basis from them versus pay up by the hour.
Which one can you pay with a credit card for?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. Maybe some of the enterprise BI vendors that have cloud solutions allow you to do it that way. I know for sure Amazon or Rackspace has a cloud option. I know for a fact you can pay with credit card with those, but the others maybe not fit on your credit card. Who knows?
Yeah, maybe not.
Depends on your limit.
Okay, well, maybe on that note, thank you very much, Steve. That's a good,
Thanks, Dave. Appreciate it.
Very interesting insights into the cloud and analytics and where that's all headed. So, from San Diego, I'm Dave Stodder with TDWI, and have a good day.